into our first topic, would like to introduce Dr. Maria de Mello from Brazil, who is going to talk with us about inclusive education policy and moderate this next session with our speaker.
Hello, everyone.
Greetings. Thank you for joining us. Dr. de Mello, would you like to speak a little bit about yourself and let the audience know where you are coming from and how you got involved in this?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And it's a pleasure to be here today and to share with everyone what we can do in our future to promote inclusive education. I am a doctor in rehabilitation science, who I have worked in Brazil and many other countries, mainly with assistive technology. And today I'm here to moderate a very nice person, Dr. Sigamoney, a leader in vision in inclusive education. And so please, Jeremy, let's get in the room with us. Hello, Dr. Sigamoney.
Hello, good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world.
Very welcome, and thank you so much to be here with us today. And it's a pleasure to have you sharing this very excited moment. Dr. Sigamoney was National Director of Inclusive Education in South Africa, extraordinary professor at the University of Western Cape, and visiting professor at Leeds Trinity University. Thank you very much again to be here with us today. And the stage is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So, hello everybody, and I'm really delighted to be involved in this conference. I noticed that there's a lot of energy in terms of inclusive education, and when South Africa experienced the transition to democracy, I joined as a National Director of Inclusive Education. So I've made some observations, and I've been doing a bit of traveling and studying, and then I moved to the Western Cape, also involved in inclusive education. And so you know, I have a great commitment to inclusive education and in my country. And so I noticed in the system, in the broader system, that we have a reading problem and we have a problem with class, social class. So you will be aware that you have a social class problem in the United Kingdom, you have a social class problem in the United States. And so I looked at this and I decided, well, I need to develop an alternative pedagogy. I need to develop an alternative narrative, because I think one of the reasons why inclusive education hasn't really taken on in the world is because of the power of special education, the power of the theory of special education, the assumptions of special education, the model of special education, the practices of special education, and the tools of special education. So there is a big interest in inclusive education, but I don't think we have advanced sufficiently at a theoretical level in terms of our assumptions, the models we use universally, our practices and tools. And I think that's where a lot of work has to be done. So in 2006, I started researching the system locally in South Africa. And I think my work in South Africa has relevance for globally. Because if you want to include children with disabilities in the mainstream curriculum, you would obviously have to look at vulnerable children in totality. And I realized that in South Africa, one of the problems that we have is that working class children don't experience much success in the system. Many children are unable to read. So I looked at the literature overseas, and I did some visits, both in the United States and in the UK, and I found that they have similar problems. So how do you have an inclusive education system where most of your children are unable to read, and where many of your children drop out of school, and when many of where your literacy and numeracy levels are so low? So this is a phenomenon in the UK. There's sufficient research to suggest that. This is a phenomenon in the United States. In many states, the reading scores and the numeracy scores are very low in the system. And so how do you have an inclusive education system when so many children can't read and write? So what I decided to do was try to produce an alternative narrative and start the debate. And so I wrote a book called Education and the Working Class: Is There Hope for an Inclusive System? In this book, I talk about developing an inclusive system, and then I address the issue of class in terms of social and cultural capital. And then I talk about creating the conditions for successful inclusion. And then I ask the question, can the contemporary bureaucracies in the world effect complex change similar to that is what is required of inclusive education? And so I call for a new theoretical framework in the system of education. And finally, I call for a social justice model. So in terms of the class issue, John Dewey told us 100 years ago that when children get into education, they have the opportunity to escape from the limitations of a social group. Now, you and I know this hasn't materialized. It has particular implications for inclusive education. So what I'm arguing is, let's move away from the rhetoric of inclusive education and let's make it possible. In the United Kingdom, in the United States, and in South Africa, there are many learners that live below the poverty line. And many of these communities and many of these children, in my opinion, have not been sufficiently looked at in terms of what the implications of their socialization in life has for an alternative pedagogy. So there's no relationship between the characteristics of communities and a pedagogy. And this is very important for inclusive education. And let me try to explain why this is very important for inclusive education. If you have a curriculum that sifts and rejects, and you have a segregated system, and you have policies in the education system where you want to implement inclusive education that has conceptual dissonance with inclusive education, how are you going to include children with disabilities? So in other words, one of the interventions has been universal design for learning. We must ask the question, how many countries in the world have a curriculum that's consistent with universal design for learning, or what they say UDL? Because what UDL does is it allows participants in the learning process to express themselves in diverse ways. And also, more importantly, to acquire knowledge in diverse ways. Now, that's not a common practice across the world. If it was a common practice across the world, you wouldn't have a problem with reading. You wouldn't have a problem with numeracy. So once again, when I started this presentation, I mentioned to you that if you want an inclusive education system, you have to make sure that your theoretical framework is right, your assumptions are right, your morals are right, your tools are right, and your practices are right. So to take that a bit further, the entire education system has to be shaped by that framework of thinking and practice. So in other words, there has to be structural adjustments, there has to be programmatic adjustments, there have to be budgetary adjustments. And from the work I have done, I don't think I've seen that, right? So here we have a group of people in Rotary where there's a great passion for inclusive education. And I think we have a huge body of sociological knowledge on inclusive education, but it hasn't been translated into a pedagogy. So I'm asking those questions. Now, how do we do that? And I think in terms of moving forward, we need to examine in the UK, which is a first world country, the United States, which is the biggest economy in the world, if I'm correct. And then you look at a country like South Africa, there are so many similarities in terms of the performance of the system when you look at vulnerable learners. And so the point of departure in terms of your framework and in terms of your assumption is to address vulnerability. Now, let's take a system like Norway, right, which is a very egalitarian society. But look at the framework of inclusive education, look at the Salamanca statement, look at the broad theoretical assumptions of inclusive education. There's no relationship between that and the organogram of the Norwegian Education Department. It is still structured and at a level of the organogram as a dual system, right? And the same applies to the United States, and the same applies to the United Kingdom, big first world countries. So in the big picture, you know, one's point of departure has to be the level and the state of marginalization and alienation of children in the system, right? So a lot of the children who have experienced barriers to learning often don't finish school, often become victims in a society where they are not celebrated. So what I'm arguing is that we need to bring these children to the center of the system. Now, I've noticed, you know, global leaders talk about inclusive education and so on. And I think what global leaders need to ask is, from the Salamanca statement, how much of progress have we made with inclusive education? So let me just also share with you that, you know, I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And my politics of identity is about trying to advocate for a liberatory pedagogy where there's meaningful change, where if you ask the question, if we make this policy decision, will it contribute to inclusive education? If we employ people, will this result in inclusive education? If we budget, will this result in inclusive education? If we develop a curriculum, will this result in inclusive education? What conceptual framework exist within the system to embrace inclusive education. Because it's very easy to romanticize the notion of inclusive education, but it doesn't have a practical transformation of the system, because we really haven't thought about this. So, there is a lot of injustices in the world. And I think, in my opinion, and what I write in my book, is that the greatest injustice in the world is when a child is not given a fair chance to experience success in the education system. And the inclusive education movement has advanced this notion of social justice and equality and so on, where children benefit from the policies and practices in education system. But if you look at the contemporary debates in the world today, particularly in societies that experience inequality, we have not made much progress. There are children in the United Kingdom that don't go to school. There's a major problem with children in the United States regarding drugs, regarding attendance at schools, regarding pass rates, and so on. Inclusive education is not only about disability. Inclusive education includes all the vulnerable populations in the education system. So let me say to you that people who have worked in the area of social justice, such as Bowles and Gintis in the United States, Pierre Bourdieu in France, Paul Willis in the UK, Diane Ray in the UK, Stephen Ball in the UK, Basil Bernstein on curriculum. And you know what all these people say? That schools in 2024 reproduce the status quo. Education systems across the world reproduce the status quo and reproduce inequality on a daily basis. So let me just talk about some practical examples here. In the UK, in some places, the challenge is, one of the biggest challenges is domestic violence. Other studies, for example, studies at Oxford have found that the greatest determinant of learning outcomes is maternal qualifications. If you look at those two factors, it tells you that in a first world country, in a developed country, a lot of progress has not been made with women, right? If your biggest indicator of success is maternal qualifications and your biggest problem is domestic violence. So what I also say in my book is that education bureaucracies have a way of constructing a false narrative. And that false narrative overlooks systemic inequalities inherent in education systems, such as socioeconomic disparities, cultural bias, unequal access to resources. And so the issue of disability is a curriculum issue. There is no special society when you become an adult. Schools must be able to contextualize their curriculum within the lived reality of people and the challenges those people are confronted with in their societies. And so if you do that, that's I think, the most significant issue in terms of creating access to the education system. In my opinion, we have not removed the significant barriers to learning that learners experience. Not only disabled learners, because inclusion is not only about disability, it's about all vulnerable groups. And I haven't seen a curriculum across the world that is able to depart from the sifting and rejecting philosophy. As educationists, I think the most important thing to do is to look at the learner in a context, not as an individual, not look at the family as a unit, not look at individuals in isolation from their environment. You need to contextualize where the learners come from, what challenges the environment poses, and our schools can provide access to learning and teaching. So another point I want to make is that a curriculum can either give access or limit access, right? So let's talk about curriculum in schooling terms as everything that's got to do about teaching and learning. How much of work has been done in the foundation phase in schools across the world, not only in South Africa, across the world, to address the contextual realities that children face? I just mentioned domestic violence. I mentioned maternal qualifications. That's research findings. There's drugs. There's alcohol. There's environments that prevent access. There's a curriculum that serves the elite in education. It is known across the world that our mainstream curriculum, not only in South Africa, is a curriculum that serves the elite. So we are in a situation where we have this, we have wonderful global movements like Rotary that promote a human rights culture in schools, but the tendency of these of bureaucracies is to ignore the kind of philosophy and practice that inclusive education requires of us. Now, I have to emphasize this point. Max Weber told us 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that bureaucracies were never designed for transformation. Virtually every country in the world is a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are designed to maintain the status quo. Then you have a philosophy and practice like inclusive education that is conceptually different from inclusive education in terms of how we conceptualize it and how we practice it. So if you name me one country in the world that has conceptualized inclusive education and it has implications for every education policy in that country, I will be surprised. So let's just talk about the issue of vulnerability and literacy and numeracy in 3 countries. Let's look at the United States, let's look at the United Kingdom, and let's look at South Africa. In 2019, the Office for Ofsted, this office that's involved with evaluation in England, spoke about narrowing the playing fields by adopting the cultural capital principle. But in 2024, the cultural capital principle has not been translated into practice in the curriculum in the UK. I see many reports about poor literacy and numeracy performance in the United States. And the education policy planners in the bureaucracy have not provided any theoretical tools or practical tools to empower teachers in the education system to compensate for the lack of cultural or social capital amongst teachers, where the education system ignores the issue of cultural capital in the way children are socialized into education. So if you look at Bernstein doesn't appear in any of the debates in the UK, and hardly ever when people talk about why children perform poorly in the United States. He talks about elaborated codes in education, he talks about social background, and he talks about education systems that reproduce social inequalities. And what they do is they reproduce social inequalities by embedding dominant class structures into their communication modes in the schooling system, right? And in all the debates and discussions, I haven't heard this across the world, right? So if Rotary and other organizations in the world want to advance a truly inclusive education system, we have to ask some fundamental questions about what does inclusive education mean for education systems? What do they mean for the people who implement inclusive education in the country? What does it mean in terms of influencing other policy areas in education that are inconsistent or have conceptual dissonance with inclusive education? The people that translate policy into practice, what are their fundamental assumptions about education? And what is a model of inclusive education in an education system in any country in the world? So when I started, I said that the power of special education still imposes itself in terms of how people see this education system as a dual education system, right? If we're having this conversation in October 2024 about advancing inclusive education system in the world, so many decades after the Salamanca Statement, we have to examine what progress have we made in inclusive education and why isn't that progress sufficient? Why are countries unable to be successful with the Sustainable Development Goals? SDG 4 is inclusive education. What are the constraints that countries are experiencing in terms of implementing inclusive education? So when I was asked to speak today, I thought very seriously about this, right? Because I don't want to speak in a superficial way. Because I think education in the world is dominated by politics. Education has been politicized. I think education has been commodified. And I think education systems are influenced by patronage. And there isn't a commitment to human rights and social justice. So let me stop there and entertain some questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to hear you, Dr. Sigamoney. Your presentation was brilliant and made us to think about it so much. We have 3 questions. I will read the first one. Could you please give us some examples showing how liberatory pedagogy can be implemented?
Okay, you want me to respond?
Oh, please, go ahead.
No. So I think if you want a liberatory pedagogy, then you need to transform how we understand education. We need to create access in the education system for learners. If you want to create access for learners in the education system, then you must allow learners to be able to express themselves in diverse ways, and you have to assess learners in diverse ways. You can't have the curriculum as a social construct that privileges certain learners at the expense of diversity. So in my opinion, you need a model of education that embeds social justice principles. And so when you ask the question, what is a liberatory pedagogy? A liberatory pedagogy is a pedagogy that celebrates diversity, that celebrates equality and equity, that celebrates being a human being.
Yes, thank you. And the second question, just go further of your words. And how do you believe that social justice framework offer concrete, actionable strategies that inform curriculum design, classroom practices, and systematic planning?
So let's start with systematic planning, and let's start with systems change. So if you implement social justice, you'll have to ask the question, if I make this decision, will it reduce inequality? If I make this decision, does the practice become more inclusive? So in a nutshell, you need social justice principles to be embedded in any curriculum planning and thinking. So at a very practical level, in terms of actionable strategies, your curriculum has to be contextualized within the lived reality of people in a country. So if so many children can't learn to read and can't learn to write, and so many children drop out of school, what kind of curriculum is that? Right? It means that the system is imposing barriers on children getting access to education. So if you want actionable strategies, you've got to start with the curriculum in any school, anywhere in the world, whether it's the UK, the US, South Africa, because teachers need to understand that the children they teach, and they have to understand that education is about love, it's about humanity, and it's about creating a better world for everybody.
Yes, you almost make me cry. And we have a third question. And the third question is, how do you understand that your research that you have done, mainly in Cape Town, can address the same problems worldwide?
So the one common phenomenon that we have with the rest of the world is inequality. If you show me any country in the world where there's no inequality, I'll be very surprised. Even the Scandinavian countries have some level of inequality, although they're supposed to be egalitarian societies. But if you look at the income gap amongst the rich and the poor in the United States, it's huge. If you look at the UK, it's huge. If you look at South Africa, it's huge. So when I did my work, I looked at the mistakes in those systems, and the challenges in those systems. And that's why in my presentation, I spoke about Ofsted, and I spoke about Stephen Ball, who comes from the UK. I spoke about Barbs and Ginders from the United States, their research. I spoke about Diane Ray, who's a sociology professor at the University of Cambridge, excuse me, who was working class herself, and the work done by Marsden and Jackson in 1962 in the UK. I mean, all these systems are victims of the politicization of education. All these systems are victims of the commodification of education. All these systems are based on patronage. And unless we don't change our fundamental thinking about education, John Dewey said that if you're born in a class, you can enjoy social mobility if you have education. Nelson Mandela said that if a child born in a peasant family can become the president of the country, if we follow the essence of education. I think globally, we've lost the essence of education. It's become a commodity. And tell me if that's not true of virtually every country in the world.
Yes.
We know different in South Africa.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you, and you know that. As a member of Rotary Club, and this special club that is international and globally, we have seen exactly what you said around the world. And now, my personal question, can I make it, Dr. Sigamoney?
Sure.
How do you think that we can work together to change this? I mean, to change this mindset regarding education around the world. I believe it's a long-term journey, but we must start from some point. And what would be this point, this starting point?
I think we need to have a narrative in education that basically is based on the essence of being human. And the essence of being human is love. And if the essence of being human is love, then every practice in education will embrace humanity, will recognize the value of human beings as special, as important, as wonderful, as a creation of this universe, rather than being objects. And so in my book, I say those things, right? And so somebody asked me the question, I made a presentation yesterday, and they said to me, well, we live in a capitalist world, and how can you change it? I think that's not having hope. We as educationists, we should always have hope, and we should always base our decisions and our planning and our thinking on the principle of love for humanity.
Jeremy, do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, I just received another question here, and the question is, how do you, Dr. Sigamoney, correlate your approach to education or your proposal to education to deal with the climate issues?
You see, in my opinion, the climate issues are being caused by big capital. And the climate issues, I mean, when they have meetings around climate and make decisions around climate, the people who are most influential in those decision-making processes are people who have a vested interest in business and accumulating wealth. And I think that we need to educate the population. And when we develop narratives in education, you ask the question, how do we change? when we develop a narrative in education, we need to take care of the environment. We need to show love to the universe. I think we need to reframe our thinking about the world, right? Because I think in the world today, there is a contestation between spiritualism versus materialism. And I think over the last 10 decades, materialism has relegated spiritualism. And I think we need to inject spiritualism into education as it concerns any debate, whether it's climate, whether it's inclusive education. We need to change the way we see education. And so I think that's the only hope we can give to the children that are following us and the younger people that are following us. Because we owe it to the children of a future world to create an environment that celebrates humanity. I don't think we celebrate humanity at the moment. We destroy humanity. And climate is the major problem that we'll encounter in the next 30 years.
I do agree.
If not already.
Yes, and I do agree with you, and I believe that our hope is education, and the education based in love, as you said, love as the basic concept and the fundamental concept to all things that we have to do in our lives. Thank you so much, Dr. Sigamoney. I do believe a lot of people will enjoy your presentation, and I hope you'll have other opportunities to discuss this further. Jeremy,
Thank you.
go ahead.
Before
Thank you.
anybody leaves this portion of the webinar, one, thank you both very much. That was absolutely beautiful. I have a lot of thoughts and my own questions, but one thing as we were talking that I realized in regards to inclusion is that we launched off in my eagerness to get us going. I neglected to give a visual description of myself, and I was wondering if both of you would be willing to do that before I take over, and then I'll do my visual description after you guys.
Jeremy, I forgot to, I'm sorry, yes, and I'm sorry to everyone. And so I am a woman, 59 years old, a white woman. I'm wearing glasses, a short hair, a very short hair, kind of gray hair. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Sigamoney, please.
So Jeremy, if I get you right, I need to explain who I am.
To describe yourself, Dr. Sigamoney.
Yeah.
Yes, simply
Okay.
to describe what you feel is important for anybody who perhaps can't see the webinar, to have a perspective of who you are.
Yeah. Okay. I've gone on in age at the moment, and so I've spent a lot of years in education. I have a lot of gray hair and I have a beard, and but that doesn't stop me from fighting for inclusive education, social justice. And I am a South African. In South Africa, they would say my ancestry is Indian, but I'm a South African. I'm a citizen of the world, and I love inclusion.
Thank you very much. I want to say that while I am a late 40s white male with graying coppery colored hair, what was once fairly red, is also long. I am wearing a black t-shirt. The background behind me is kind of the wooded backyard where I am lucky enough to live. But I am also struck as I look at our images on the screen that with a few more years and a really dark tan, I think it would be hard to tell both myself and Dr. Sigamoney apart. So I find that interesting, being from opposite sides of the world. I think there's something important in that. So do either of you have any closing thoughts that you want to share in our last 5 minutes? I will refrain from asking any of my questions because I feel it's important you get a few last moments if there's anything else you want to share.
Dr. Sigamoney, you are our guest. Please make the final comments.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Maria, and thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, the organizers of the conference. I appreciate having a presence here. I just want to say, you know what? We must fight the good fight. And sometimes it's not going to give you the kudos to get a promotion and to drive a Mercedes Benz and have a house on the beach. But fighting the good fight is what we need to do. Because when you plant the seeds, it will always grow. And we live a short life in this world. There's 8 billion people. The world is very old. We have a few years to live. So in that time that we have, we must make the lives of other people better. And so I encourage you to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sigamoney. And I agree with all these words, and I hope a lot of people can hear you. Thank you. So thank you to all to be here with us today. And I hope everybody enjoyed our conversation, our presentation. Hope see you next time. Thank you.